Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a mystery that is just absolutely haunting. Imagine living in a quiet, safe suburb. You know, the kind of place where kids ride their bikes freely and parents literally don't think twice about letting them walk to a friend's house. That was Oakland County, Michigan back in the 1970s. But as we're going to see today, that peace was completely shattered by a phantom we now know as the Oakland County child killer. Let's dive in. It's hard to overstate just how jarring this contrast was. On one hand, you've got this idyllic suburbia, a total haven, but then harsh reality just abruptly kicks the door down. Over a span of just 13 months, 4 children vanished one by one. They were later found murdered, leaving this entire region completely paralyzed by fear. I mean, this wasn't just a string of crimes. It felt like the sudden arrival of an apex predator in a community that genuinely thought it was immune to that kind of horror. Part 1. 13 Months of Terror. The Disappearances. Let's just lay out the timeline here to see exactly how this tragic sequence of events unfolded. Between February 1976 and March 1977, 4 kids, all between the ages of 10 and 12, were taken right out of their supposedly safe neighborhoods. It starts in February 76 with 12-year-old Mark Stebbins. Then, things escalate horribly in December when 11-year-old Joel Robinson vanishes. Just weeks later, in January 77, 10-year-old Christine Mihalich is abducted. And finally, in March of 77, 11-year-old Timothy King disappears. 4 kids in just over a year. The sheer speed and frequency of these abductions, that's what really set off a massive panic across the greater Detroit area. Let's look a bit closer at those first 2 victims. Mark Stebbins disappeared on February 15, 1976, just walking home after leaving a local ice rink. His body was found 4 days later in a business parking lot. Then, right before Christmas that same year, 11-year-old Jill Robinson left her house after getting into an argument with her mom. She vanished, and her body was discovered 4 days later along the side of a road. But in her case, she had been shot. This marked a really disturbing escalation in the sheer violence the killer was using against these children. And that brings us to a frankly staggering number, 19 days. In January 1977, 10-year-old Christine Mihalich disappeared while walking to a local convenience store just to buy a magazine. She actually endured the longest period of captivity among all 4 of the victims. For 19 agonizing days, nobody knew where she was, until her body was tragically discovered in a snow-covered ditch on a rural road. You can only imagine the psychological toll that kind of waiting period took on her family, and really on the whole community who were glued to the evening news every single night. The final, and probably the most highly publicized abduction, was 11-year-old Timothy King. He vanished in March 1977 after walking to a nearby drugstore. Now, his case got massive media attention, largely because of one huge tip. Witnesses actually reported seeing Timothy get into a blue AMC Gremlin, with a man matching a very specific description. 6 days later, Timothy's body was found. And then, the killings just mysteriously stopped. After March 77, no more children were taken like this. Moving to Section 2, the babysitter profile, and some truly bizarre anomalies. This brings us to a deeply unsettling part of the case, the psychological profile of the killer based on the post-mortem evidence. Okay, what's really bizarre about all of this is the almost domestic nature of the captivity. I mean, this is definitely not your typical crime scene profile. The kids were held anywhere from 4 to 19 days, but when they were found, they were oddly clean and well-groomed. Evidence showed they'd been bathed and fed. In some cases, their clothes had literally been freshly laundered and pressed. Plus, their bodies were deliberately placed in spots where they'd be found quickly, almost like the killer was taunting the police. Because of these weirdly domestic details, taking care of the victims before ultimately murdering them, the media at the time actually dubbed this unidentified suspect the Babysitter. Section 3, Suspects and Dead Ends. A massive investigation. With the entire community living in absolute terror, law enforcement had to mount an unprecedented response. And unprecedented it absolutely was. The public fear was so intense that parents were locking kids indoors, schools were inventing completely new safety protocols on the fly, and thousands of tips just started pouring in. We're talking about one of the largest police task forces in Michigan's entire history. Hundreds of officers working around the clock for months, sifting through mountains of tips from a terrified public who were side-eyeing every single blue gremlin on the road. But despite this monumental effort, the investigation just kept hitting dead ends. So, 2 main investigative theories eventually emerged. First, you have the lone killer theory. A prime example of this was a man named Christopher Bush, who was being investigated for unrelated crimes. But the catch here is that it was never definitively proven that he was actually connected to these specific murders. On the flip side, you have the exploitation ring theory. Some investigators looked at the highly coordinated nature of how the victims were taken and disposed of and thought, hey, this has to be a group working together. But again, investigators couldn't find the hard evidence needed to conclusively link a larger ring directly to these 4 deaths. Let's pause for a second on that name from the first theory, Christopher Bush. He remains a highly prominent person of interest in the lore of this case. He was actually investigated for unrelated child abuse allegations and died by suicide in 1978. Now, while some detectives were firmly convinced he had ties to the Oakland County child killer, we have to note that his involvement is still just an unproven theory. There's never been a definitive forensic link to officially close the case with his name. We're just looking at the historical record here, but it's a huge piece of the puzzle.
Which brings us to our final section, a community changed forever, the lingering trauma, because the impact of these crimes definitely didn't stop when the 1970s ended.
As one quote puts it, an entire generation of children growing up in Oakland County during the late 1970s remember being warned constantly about strangers. This case is incredibly significant, not just because it's famously unsolved, but because of how profoundly it shattered an entire community's sense of safety. Suddenly, kids were being watched like hawks by their parents. Everyone was living under this heavy shadow of fear that lingered for years, even decades after the murders abruptly stopped. It literally fundamentally changed how an entire generation of parents raised their kids in those suburbs. But, there is still hope. Even decades removed from the tragedy, the families of these victims are still fighting for answers. And today, the Michigan State Police are taking some really exciting steps. They're re-examining old physical evidence, they're using advanced forensic genealogy, and applying modern DNA technology that detectives in the 70s couldn't have even dreamed of. Science has finally caught up, and it really might be the key to unlocking the truth once and for all.
So that leaves us with one final haunting question. Did the Oakland County child killer take their secrets to the grave, completely evading justice? Or will the relentless march of modern science finally unmask them and bring some long overdue closure to 4 grieving families and a totally shattered community? It's a dark mystery, but one that reminds us just how fragile safety can be and how important the ongoing quest for truth really is. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking questions, and we'll see you next time.